have a very cozy relationship.
Is there any doubt that President Putin knows this is happening?
Of course, there's always doubt. Doubt is built in to the system on purpose to give Putin plausible deniability. Putin operates by a system of signals, essentially. Very rarely does somebody like Putin, in, for example, another large Russian organization, a bank, a state company, give very specific orders. That person wants to insulate themselves. I mean, this is a system handed down from the 1990s when oligarchs wanted to insulate themselves from dirty things that their subordinates were doing. So Putin will give a signal and say, we're going in this direction. And the system will interpret it. It kind of trickles down the pyramid, the bureaucratic pyramid under him. And at each level, the bureaucrats try to interpret what that signal means, try to please their immediate bosses who are trying to please their immediate bosses who are trying to please their immediate bosses. It's not a very efficient way of governing. It often results in errors. It's like a game of broken telephone, essentially, with much higher stakes. But Putin may have given the order, but he may have also just said, you know, this is kind of the general direction we're going. I think we're not going to find that out for a while yet. If you look at what happened, for example, with the invasion of Crimea,
add some commentary to this, and
Putin denied for a long time that the little green men, as they were called, the polite people who showed up in Crimea wearing uniforms with the latest weaponry, that they were Russian soldiers.
Let's go, boys. Let's go, boys. Number 2, Berlin Urlash.
There's nowhere else in the world I'd rather be than on this field right now with you guys. At all.
Anywhere.
A year later,
Right here. This is it.
Guys, this is what we did for 12 weeks.
Sponsored documentary airs on Channel 1, which is the main Kremlin TV channel, and Putin says, yeah, I gave the orders. But that he may not have given
We're doing
That's
commentary.
the thing, is he may be taking credit retroactively.
So
he may have given the orders. I think we won't know for quite a while until
allied action
Putin's dead and the archives are open.
But of course, he's presided.
Let's go, boys. Let's go, boys. Number 2, Berlin Urlash.
There's nowhere else in the world I'd rather be than on this field right now with you guys. At all.
Anywhere. Right here. This is it.
Guys, this is what we did for 12 weeks, 10, 12 weeks, whatever it was. It all comes down to this game right here. Boys.
Some of them were blackmailed into working for the Russian government. And at any point,
Let's go, boys. Let's go, boys. Number 2, Berlin Urlash.
There's nowhere else in the world I'd rather be than on this field right now with you guys.
So again, there's always,
At all.
ultimately,
Anywhere.
the state is responsible.
Right here. This is it.
Guys, this is what we did for 12 weeks, 10, 12 weeks, whatever it was. It all comes down to this game right here. Boys.
That part of the world. So place him there for me. Will you tell me who this man is, what the ethos is?
Putin is stationed in Dresden in the late 80s in East Germany. And by all accounts, he's kind of a middling KGB officer. He's not exceptionally talented or of exceptional promise. But the collapse of the Berlin Wall catches him in Dresden. And there are accounts of Putin frantically shoveling documents, sensitive documents, into the furnace as Germany is changing around him. And the Iron Curtain is essentially evaporating before his eyes. He calls, there's also a famous story about this, he calls home, he calls Moscow, trying to understand what he is to do, trying to get orders, and Moscow doesn't respond. And this is, according to many biographers who have chronicled Putin's life, a massive, massive trauma for him, that this massive historical event is happening. Soviet influence is collapsing before his eyes, and he calls home, he radios home, and home isn't there. And this is something that he has been trying so hard never to repeat. And I think what he learned from Glasnost and Perestroika, watching it from far away, is that you don't do this. As soon as you start loosening the controls a little bit, start letting oxygen into the system, it starts to rot, it starts to rust, it starts to fall apart from the inside. And you see this in his own experience as president, when he let Dmitry Medvedev, his very close lieutenant, take over for 4 years while he was prime minister. Because of the way the Russian constitution was written, you can't have more than 2 consecutive presidential terms. He steps back a little bit. He lets Medvedev, a trusted lieutenant again, run the show for 4 years. Medvedev, who is relatively liberal, at least compared to Putin, allows more oxygen into the system. He starts letting people talk about corruption. Official people, deputy prime ministers, are talking about corruption openly at investment forums to Western bankers. It's very similar to Glasnost. We're talking about our problems openly. We're not hiding them. We're not whitewashing them. He's letting the media flourish. He's letting the media ask questions and investigate, right? He's not cracking down on them as Putin would have. And what happens? Massive protests in 2011 who are calling for Putin to resign. And they're happening as the Arab Spring is happening. They're happening after a whole wave of colored revolutions in Russia's near abroad, in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, in Ukraine. And what Putin sees is, here's American regime change coming for him, finally. He had long suspected it, starting with the ouster of Saddam Hussein in 2003, and continuing into Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, then Egypt, then Libya. He knew that the Americans would eventually come for him, that they would try to oust him. And here he sees that his replacement, the guy kind of warming his chair or holding his spot, has let it come home to Moscow. And he, I'm sure, was reminded of these moments in Dresden when openness eventually brought collapse of the empire, and he was going to do everything he could to stop it.
Backing up just for a moment. The way it's described to me, the thing that happens to the KGB and the KGB people, they were shipwrecked after, at the end of it all, they were explained.
When the Soviet Union collapses, ironically, one of the few things to survive the collapse are the security services. The KGB is, on one hand, it's dismembered, it's renamed as the FSB, parts of it, various directorates end up as other security service entities, but it kind of survives more than other parts of the Soviet Union, and so they're able later to reconstitute themselves and grab more power. On the other hand, they're also missing out. They're missing out on the privatization of the 1990s. They're seeing these young guys who were in the Komsomol, the Youth Communist League in the 80s, the Communist Youth League in the Soviet Union. These young college students use their connections to become incredibly wealthy and snatch up the jewels of the Soviet industrial empire. They're either stripping them down and shipping, getting their money overseas, or they're building these huge companies out of it, and they're becoming fabulously wealthy. And where are the former KGB guys in all of this? With very few exceptions, they are the bodyguards, they're the security directors, they have gone from the elite, the so-called, this is the Russian expression for it, the white bone of, the kind of the aristocracy of the Soviet regime. They had, they had the best education, they had the language training, they were allowed to travel when few others were. And they've gone from that, from the top of the pyramid, to basically the valets, the security guards.
The deputy mayors of St. Petersburg.
Right.
That's, so how does Putin, in that context, become prime minister and then eventually, of course, president? What was happening during the Yeltsin years that Putin was watching?
Putin never disappeared. He was active in various government roles. He was working for the mayor of St. Petersburg, the first post-communist mayor of St. Petersburg. He's a master bureaucrat. Here's the thing. Russia has always been a bureaucratic autocracy. That was the case under the Tsars, that was the case under the Soviets, and that's the case in Putin's time. This is how, for example, Stalin became the general secretary. He was an amazing bureaucrat. He out-bureaucrated all the other bureaucrats. And Putin does too. This is one of the ways he has continued to rule. He is very good at the bureaucracy of all of it. He can out-bureaucrat all the other bureaucrats. The other thing is he is quite unremarkable. He's very gray, very vanilla, and he seems like the safe candidate for the oligarchs to put in place in order to guarantee everything that they have accumulated in the 90s and everything that the Yeltsin family has accumulated in the 90s. And he makes a promise to Yeltsin and the Yeltsin family that he will not go after them or their holdings when he comes to rule Russia. And he never does. He never does. And one of the issues with Putin is this is a man who's getting older. He's about to run for his 4th term in office. That ends in 2024. If he lives that long, he'll be 72 when that's done. Can he find somebody like a Putin who will promise that he will not go after his holdings, his family's extensive holdings, and the people around him? Can he find somebody who will guarantee that he will not cannibalize his empire?
How important was you figure the apartment bombings were to him and the furtherance of his career, independent of whether he had anything to do with it or not? The way the story goes, he strikes, he acts with strength.
When the apartment bombings happen, it gives him the excuse he needs to finally go after what has become a morass in Chechnya and neighboring Dagestan. They've become incredibly violent centers of Wahhabism on Russian territory. And Putin goes after them full force. It's also important because he finally emerges in the public eye for the first time. He is seen on TV as a doer, a man of action. He goes down there, he's talking to the troops, he is in command, and not only his recognition, but his popularity ratings just skyrocket for the first time ever. And it puts him in a fantastic place for the 2000 presidential election. Remember, he was just named kind of a placeholder for Yeltsin in 1999, on December 31st, 1999. He now has to win a presidential election as somebody who's barely known to the public. And this image of him as a defender of the homeland, a fighter of terrorism, a man of action, a man who can get things done, really helps him coast to victory in 2000.
Okay, so Putin is elected, he becomes President Putin, and how does Russia change? What does he do?
So it's important to remember, as much as the West hates and loathes and fears Putin now, they were kind of hopeful when he came to power. The Western foreign policy elite was writing about how maybe this is the guy who's going to bring order to Russia. Russia had a very weak central government. It was effectively run by oligarchs and various clans, and it was extremely corrupt and violent and chaotic. The population was quite poor. It had gone through one massive economic crisis after the other. Remember, he took power after the August 1998 meltdown of the Russian economy. And the hope in the West was he's finally going to stabilize Russia. He's finally going to get these crazy oligarchs under control. And he does start to do that. He starts sending very clear, unmistakable signals